All right, as of right now, we have two people who aren't here today and one person who's here but who was sick last week. Okay? So, to try to get everybody back into the swing, so to speak, as much as we can, as fast as we can, I'm going to kind of change around what I wanted to do this morning, and we're going to do something a little different. A couple things before we start. Number one. All right. Okay. Mr. Corrigan was in here on Friday. I don't want to single you out. Please don't ever say to him, "Oh, I always play games in here." Because when you do that, he comes in and talks to me and asks me if that's true. And the look on his face is not one that I really want to see. All right? So, although I don't do it much, he is really encouraging me to strongly walk around more. And let's say that you think you busted your ass today. All right? You know, it was a lab day and you're working really hard. You work really hard from 8 till 11. And now you're thinking, you know what, I just want to play games for an hour. Don't do it. Please don't frickin' do it. I mean, personally, do I have a problem with it? And there's a part of me that thinks you deserve to. All right? But this place is looked at as though it's a job. And I'm not going to lie to you. When I was my first programming job, we had a program that once I was there and I got kind of accepted by people that I wasn't that big a jerk, they gave me this thing that I could plug into my computer. So whenever my boss came around, all I had to do was do a Control X, and it looked like I was doing all sorts of stuff on my screen. All right? But other than that, I could do whatever the hell I wanted to. So if I knew he was coming around, I had to quick do a Control X. Now that said, it's not like I screwed around a lot. I really didn't. The internet wasn't what it is now. Nothing was as sophisticated as it is now. But there were times I'd be reading something, or I would be playing a game, or whatever. All right? The other thing, please, Evan, take off your hat. He's going to be looking now, because that's my penance, so to speak, is he's going to be coming in here if and when he feels like it. And I know he's going to come in that door because he's going to want to see what you're doing. All right? Now, I'm not looking at anybody in particular, but make sure you are abiding by the dress code. I noticed at least one person last week had white socks on. That's not considered acceptable. All right? I noticed that, this wasn't this week. I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago. Somebody came in, although they were nice ones, had tennis shoes on. That's not acceptable. All right? I don't make these rules. In fact, maybe I told you this, but literally, we have our in-service in St. Louis like the Thursday before you guys start on Monday. What happens every single time is Don Pohl, who's our vice president, he reads from us out of the student handbook. The students should do this. The students should do this. We have to put up with that for over an hour. He's got it right on the screen, but he's reading it anyway. And the person behind me will go, "Yep, now he's going to talk about the smoking policy." Okay, now let's talk about the smoking policy. See, and it's like all the time. Finally, I told Charles this morning, I said, you know what he ought to do? Is he ought to come here every frickin' semester, and they ought to round up every single one of you, and he ought to walk up and down the aisle and read that and make you listen to it. All right? And if he makes us come too, that's fine. But they are rules. I don't make those rules, but we are all supposed to abide by them. So you answer me this question, not out loud. All right? But Matthew, let's say you get the job of your dreams. It's $100,000 a year to start, etc. But they got all sorts of rules that you just hate. You got to wear a suit and a tie. You got to wear it, everywhere. Except if you're taking a dump. You can take it off in there. But other than that, you got to wear it all the time. In fact, if they see you and, your top button's unbuttoned, you get written up. For $100,000 a year, is it worth that? That's a decision you have to make. All right? I worked for a company like that. I couldn't take it. Honestly, I couldn't. I made good money. I hated it. But everybody's different. All I'm saying is while you're here, you have to abide by these rules. All right, enough of that sermon. Second, last week I sent everybody this, even if you weren't here. It says resent with hopefully the correct files. You've got this folder that was called OOP. It was a zip folder right here. First thing I want to do is I want to go look through some of the stuff that was in that folder. All right? Why? Because I want to go through a couple of those examples that we talked about last week again, starting very slowly. All right? Then, after we go through those examples slowly, then we're going to do the Chapter 9 test review. All right? Then we're going to go through, I'm going to give you a hard copy of yet a different example that we're going to go through as a class. I think I told you this before. On the off chance I did not, Chapters 9 and 10 and 11, in my humble opinion, are the hardest in the book. All right? Now, Chapter 13 is no piece of cake. Chapter 14 is a little different. Chapter 11, or 12 is pretty simple. 13 is a little complex, so is 14. All right? I've changed what I'm going to do in here. What I hope we will do by the end of this week, is we'll have gone through Chapter 9 and we'll have gone through Chapter 10. All right? We'll see where we are time-wise. Next week, we will go through Chapter 11. By the end of next week, you will have a test on Chapters 9, 10, and 11. All right? You will have a pre-test first that will be very similar to the test. Speaking of which, for those 7 of the 8 of you who took the test, the grades are an inside ranking. All right? They've all been graded. All right? Just so you know. Everybody got at least a C. All right? And they were all over the place. In fact, they were A or they were C. All right? I will give them back. Jesse's going to take his tomorrow. And when he takes it tomorrow, then I will give back yours while he's taking the test. All right? So let's look at these examples. They may or they may not make a lot of sense. So it is up to you as we go through these that if you like, I don't understand what the hell this is supposed to be doing, then you have to ask. That's all I can say. All right. So the first thing, we've talked about this a little bit again the other day. What we're going to start with now, what we're going to be starting with now is the fact that we're going to have, at least for the next couple chapters, 2 different files. Main is literally going to be our driver. And what main is going to do is main is going to create a bunch of objects. That's all it's going to do. That's its job. In fact, some books even put it that it's an object factory. If you remember, we talked about this last week in Chapter 9. So what's an object? An object is an instance of a class. What's a class? It's a blueprint. I mentioned this to you last week, but just to kind of say it again, that if I decide, now my wife is kind of pushing me, maybe we ought to just build a new house here. Okay. All right. And actually, I don't have a problem with that. We have to get a lot, etc. But if we buy a lot, okay, and we decide on a house, the chances are not real good that the next day somebody's going to come in there, dig a really huge hole, and just start building it. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that what happens is we will talk to an architect, building contractor, or somebody that will show us a blueprint, right? And they'll say, this is what we do. And then we could tell them, yeah, because like the way my wife is, with the house that we have right now, sorry if I'm boring you, but the house we have right now, she decided that she wanted that house. We were living in a different house. So she went and grabbed the realtor's phone number, called him, asked him to come over. He came over immediately. She said, I want this house. She didn't even ask me. She just said, I want this house. I come home and there's a for sale sign on the house I'm living in. I actually thought it was a mistake. All right. So the next day, I said, can I at least drive by it? Because she didn't even tell me where it was or anything. All right. So the next day, she goes over there herself. And she's actually a very quiet person. She really and truly is. And she goes over there and she asks who's in charge. Because they're putting, the house is going up. And they're putting up the bathroom, walls, ceiling, etc., all that stuff. And she talks to the guy and she says, is that the upstairs bathroom? And he said, yes. And she said, okay, I want you to fix it. I want a skylight in there. And he didn't even know who the hell she was. He's like, excuse me? She's like, no, I'm not asking. Put a skylight in there. Stop what you're doing and put a skylight in there. Well, the guy ended up calling the contractor. He said, yeah, they're buying a house. You do whatever the hell she wants. All right? The point is, there was a blueprint. And on that blueprint, it didn't have a skylight in that bathroom for that kind of house. Okay? But the point is, the rest of the house was set up in a certain way. Our house was an instance of the blueprint of that house. So our house was an object of the house class. All right? So in this example right here, what we're doing here is we're creating a student class. So what we're saying is each student has these three qualities. All right? So we're making a class of student. So imagine each one of you were part of that. All right? So each one of you has an ID number, which is pretty, good because you all have a rank and ID number. Probably none of you know what yours is, but that's okay. Each of you has a last name, and each of you has a grade point average, or at least will by the end of the semester. All right? These things right here, just so you know, I don't want to throw too much terminology at you, but these are, I'm going to say, declare instance variables. That means that each instance or each time I create a student object, that object will have this stuff. Now, if I make 8 of those, you'll each have a different ID number. You'll each have a different last name. Conceivably, you'll each have a different GPA. Does that make sense? All right. So this, what you see in here, in these lines, from line 10 through 69, all right, forgetting about the rest of it. This is setting up a student class. This says that every student will have this stuff. This says that when we go in there and we want to assign, if we want to assign a grade to a student, that's what we do. We call that. Not directly. The system calls that for us. So when we come in our other file and we say this, first ID number equal 123. When that line gets hit, it calls that line right there. Value becomes 123 and it gets assigned to that student's ID number. All right? Then the next thing, the same kind of thing, is we come in here and we say their last name is Anderson. When that line gets hit, it calls this line. Value becomes Anderson and it assigns it to that person's last name. Then, notice there's a little bit of code in here. All right? Then we come in one more time and we say, okay, that person's GPA is 3.5. All right? So when it hits that, it comes in here and it says, is it greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 4? Yes, it is. So that 3.5, which is value, gets assigned to grade point average for that student. Does that make sense? All right. Then we look at the second student. All right. 789. So we come in here. We set their ID number. The value is 789. So that gets set to ID number. Then we come in and we say their last name. So Daniels becomes the value of value. So that's Daniels' is last name. Then we come in and we do one more time here. And now we say 4.1. Again, as I put in the comment, that's illegal. Because we come in here and we say, is it greater than or equal to 0? Yes. Is it less than or equal to 4? No. So since it's an and, both sides of this must be true. One side's false, so this is false. So we do the else. So instead of their GPA being a 4.1, it becomes a 0.0. All right? Why am I showing you that? Why am I taking the time to tell you that? Because when we get done, we're telling you to display both students' information. So what you notice when we do this, does that make sense? All right? The biggest thing that people have is, I even get this. Why the hell do we need to do object orientation? All right? And the smart-ass answer is because that's what most languages do. The good news is when you do it in a lot of languages, you do it without really having to even know you're doing it. All right? But like I said, the short answer is that's how most languages are going, because it results in less code. And since it results in less code, if I can write the same code, there's a lot of code reuse. Since I can reuse the same code, it makes my life as a programmer easier. And as I think I told you last week, it also makes the life of a manager easier, because when they hear less code, immediately they think, oh, well, I can now hire less people because it's less code to write. All right? That's because a lot of managers just don't get it. All right? Yeah, you might be writing less code, but now you've got more time to test and more time to write better code. All right? So that's the first one. So my question to you is, looking at this, is there anything that's in this first example here that doesn't make sense to you? Yes.
On the solution file, we're storing the ID number in the value and the last name in the value. So how does it down at the bottom for the grade point average? No, not put the same as the value.
It does that because what happens is it's being called here. That's calling what's called the setter for the ID number. That's the setter for the last name, and that's the setter for the GPA. So it's always, value is just whatever value we just passed it. And it knows which one to call because we said here ID number, and we said here last name, and we said here grade point average. All right? The other thing to realize when you look at this, and please look at this because this is maybe the most important thing, and I may or may not have gone over it with you last week, but notice when we create these variables, see how we've got ID number, last name, and grade point average? Would you agree that every one of those starts with a lowercase letter? Not meant to confuse you, but I'm just saying. When you look at it here, the routines that manipulate those do not start with a lowercase letter. See that? Don't make that a little ID. That's the variable. But typically you use the same name, but you start it with an uppercase letter. All right, so the lowercase one is the variable. The uppercase one is the method, the function, the routine that will manipulate that variable. All right? Now, what we're doing with these two, right there, the ID number, and right there, the last name, we are not doing any data validation. We're assuming that the person who's giving us that information understands what the hell they're supposed to be doing. All right? What do I mean? Well, watch this. If you look up on the screen here, where we set what if I just transpose these? So what if I said the ID number was equal to Anderson? And what if I said that the last name was equal to 123? Well, you'll notice when you look at that, I'm getting two errors. The system is smart enough to know, wait a minute. It says I can't go and take what's in a string and convert it to an integer. That doesn't make any sense to me. All right? So there's some built-in stuff from the system here. Is it still possible for you to put something in that would confuse the system? Well, you know, I've said this to people before. It's not a joke. You versus the computer. Now, this is changing with artificial intelligence and machine learning and everything. But whether you realize this or not, you are a hell of a lot more powerful than the computer is, whether you believe that or not. And I always tell people, you also always have the ultimate power because you can turn the thing off. All right? Now, you know, it's coming. The day is coming when you do that and it'll turn itself back on. I mean, that's going to happen. Okay? But for right now, you are a lot more powerful. But they try to put in hooks so it's hard for you to screw up. All right? So we really don't have to do any checks for these two. Because if we put in something that's not an ID number, that's not a number, or if we put in a name like this, now could we put in here, for example, negative? It doesn't mind that. That would be really weird. All right? But we could do that. All right? What if we did that? It's going to come up and it's going to print. Let's see if it does. See that? That doesn't look very good. So how could we fix that? So that if we did that, well, all we'd have to say, I just want you to see this, is for this ID number, all right, if I came in here and said this, math.abs value. Do you all know what absolute value is? All right, I'm going to take for granted that one or more of you don't want to say it. Okay, I asked Jesse his age. I don't know what it is. No offense. I don't care. Let's say I ask him his age and he says 20. Okay? I'm 61. There's 41 years between us. Would you agree? It doesn't matter if I say 61 minus 20 or 20 minus 61. But if I say 20 minus 61, it gives me negative 41. Absolute value says throw away the negative sign if there is one. That's all. So by doing that, now if I come in here and do that, and I run the program, now notice it's back to 123. So we could put in a check like that. So if somebody doesn't know what they're doing and puts in a negative number, okay, we could do that if we wanted to, needed to. Which, the one that's shown in here? We'll go over that in just a second. But what if we did this? I mean, is it still possible to break this? The answer is, what if I come in here and do this? All right, see that? All right, now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to run it again. Notice it's giving me an error. And it's telling me, that's now a long. That's too big. It's bigger than an int. So again, there are some built-in checks. Do you understand what I'm saying? There are some built-in checks. So there's certain things that we can account for, and there's other things that the system will account for us. All right? So let's go back and look at this. I think this is what you're talking about here. All right. What this is saying is this is our first field. Okay? And this is our first field, and it should take up 5 characters. Okay? Now, it should take up 5 characters, and what that means is, since the ID number is only 3 characters, we get 2 blank spaces. All right? And just to show you, just to prove that to you, I know this isn't exactly what you asked, but let's just to prove this. Let's put this in. See that? Does that make more sense? Okay. So it says take up 5 spaces. So the biggest student number we expect to have is 99,999. That's the biggest one we expect. All right. If we knew we were going to have millions of students, we would make that bigger. All right. All right. Then the next thing says, so this is field 0, this is field 1, and this is field 2. Does that make sense? So this right here means this field. This right here means this field. And this right here means this field. All right? Okay. This, I believe what they mean is this should basically be offset 10 spaces from wherever the other one ends. 10 spaces from the end. Not sure why they did that. Again, it's just a formatting thing, all right? And then this one means this should take up to 6 spaces. That's going to mean, because the biggest one we could have would be like 4.0, 4.0. It's going to mean 3 blank spaces before it. All right. I don't know if I answered your question or not. This one, I'm not sure why they did it like this. I have absolutely no idea. All right. I mean, if you're going to do that and show people formatting, you should do a better job of explaining it than what they did in the book, which was not at all. All right. So, again, maybe I didn't totally answer the question, but my question is there anything else in this program right here? And I appreciated the question. I appreciate any questions on this. You are going to, within a week, 10 days, whatever, you're going to write a program where you're going to have to do this. So if it doesn't make sense, you're going to have to do it. My recommendation for your next test, there'll be one program. My recommendation is you make it a console like this, because it'll be much easier for you to do. All right? All right. Let me get rid of that one. I don't want to save anything. Now I'm going to bring up the next one. Do it like this. And I want you to understand too, even though we are showing these, even though I just recommended to you that you do them as consoles, you can C-A-N, you can write GUI C# programs that use classes. You can do that. All right? How would I do that? Well, imagine, for the example that I just gave you a second ago, that I drew this. And I had here, for example, ID number. All right, so this was a label and a text box right here. Then I had last name. And that was a text box right here. And then I had GPA. And that was a text box right here. And I had my typical buttons. Calculate. Clear. Exit. All right. Then what I'd have to do is, if you came in here and you put in 1, 2, 3, that would become the number. In here, if you put in, I think one of them was Daniels, and that would become in here. If we came in here and we put in 4.1, then when we click calculate, what would happen is that would be 1, 2, 3, that would be Daniels, and that would end up being 0.0. Does that make sense? Then after we did that, we would have to create a new object to do that and throw it. Maybe we would even, maybe we down here or whatever. Maybe we'd have a list box, and when you got done, it would show it down here. Something like that. But what I'm telling you is everything that we just did as a console, you could do as a GUI. One of the reasons on the test, and I'm not telling you, I don't think, speaking out of turn, even I know you haven't taken it yet, you write a console app. Then I ask you to take, remember I asked you to take the same thing and turn it into a GUI. The idea is, was there work you had to do? Yes. Was there a lot of work you had to do? No. Ideally, that's something you should have been able to do in 15 minutes. All right? And I know there's 2 people in this room that got 110 out of 100. So I know they knew how to do it. Another person got 100 out of 100. All right? Because evidently Evan didn't want to put the names down. All right? But, so they did the extra credit. All right? But the main rationale behind that was to show you that anything you do as a GUI, you can do as a console, and anything you do as a console, you can do as a GUI. All right? So let's look at this next example here. All right? Now, let's run it first. All right. Now, if you look here, the first two records are exactly the same as they were before. Just so you know, there's no change, nothing. So we set the first one, we set the ID to 123, the last name to Anderson, the GPA to 3.5. Then we set the ID to 789, the last name to Daniels, and we put an illegal GPA in there, 4.1, so it changed to 0.0. All that makes sense? Then we added a third record. We gave them a GPA of 4.56. We gave them a last name of Marco, and we gave them a GPA of 2.4. Then we added another record where we gave them nothing. But what we're going to look at in just a minute is when you create an object, which is what we did in the last example, all right, when you create an object, a special method or function is called that's called a constructor. In the first example we just went through that had these two records, we had what was called a default constructor that did absolutely nothing. Nothing. This constructor says if you pass it in and you put in nothing, then automatically set the last name, set the ID number to 0, set the last name to XXX, and set the GPA to 0. Just do that automatically. So that's what we're going to look at right now, is how all that stuff was done. Ideally, what happens when you look at this, I'm going to come back to this in just a minute, but if you look right here, that's exactly the same as what was in the last example. Exactly. That's exactly the same as what was in the last example. Those two are exactly the same. I'm going to skip these two things just for a second, and notice my ID number, my last name, my grade point average. Those are exactly the same. So what's different in this example are these two methods, right here and right here. I'm actually going to make this small enough so I can show you both of them. All right, make it a little bigger. There we go. And what this says is, okay, in this case, I'm creating a brand new student object, and I'm passing into them an ID, I'm passing into them a name, and I'm passing into them a GPA. So I'm passing in 3 pieces of information. Does that make sense? All right. And what this says right here, if you look on the screen, that says whatever value I passed in as the ID, that's what I'm going to use right there. This one says whatever value I passed in for the last name, that's what I'm going to use right there. And this one says whatever value I passed in for the GPA, I'm going to use right here. Okay? Does that make sense? There's a mapping. I mean, it's happening for us automatically. All right? It was open for a second. I thought maybe I forgot to turn that on. All right. This one says if I pass in nothing, assume the ID number is 0. So 0 is what gets sent. That's what value is equal. Then it's saying last name is XXX. That is what value is equal to right there. And then it says the GPA is 0.0. And that's what gets passed in here. Does all that make sense? So when we create brand new student objects, we can either pass in nothing, or we have to pass in 3 things. If I try to create a brand new student object and I pass in an ID and a name, but I don't pass in a GPA, I'm going to get an error. Because the system will look for one of these 2 constructors. It says we only have 2 of them. You got to either pass me in 3 things or pass me in nothing. So if I try to pass in 1 thing or 2 things or 4 things, it's going to give me an error. All that makes sense? So then it's just a matter of coming back and looking here. So we create 4 students. All right? We create this first one. And you look, wait a minute, that's a blank one. So shouldn't that first student have been 0xxx and 0.0? And the answer is it would be if we didn't go back and set those things. This right here, this and this, these call those two setters. This calls the setter for ID number. That calls the setter for last name. That calls the setter for grade point average. Calls the setter for ID number. Calls the setter for last name. Calls the setter for grade point average. This display here with the thing in here that I don't like, and etc. That calls the getter. All right. So everything that you see in here, that's going to call on each one of these. It's going to call that setter. It's going to call that setter, and it's going to call that setter, depending on whether you're dealing with the ID number or the last name or the grade point average. This thing that's right here, that display routine, all right, this is going to call that getter or that getter or that getter. And you,
why they start with return?
pardon?
Is that why they start with return?
Well, all it is, that's its only job. All right. So again, in other words, this. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but it's like, what's your last name? And you say your last name. That's what I'm returning. That's it. I'm spitting it back at you. It's already been set, so I'm just spitting it back at you. Am I answering your question? Okay, I just want to make sure I am. All right. So again, when we come in here, we do the first student. Okay? And then we set all this stuff. And I want you to understand this. And what I mean is this. Okay? Do you all agree? Again, not trying to throw anything by you. This first student, this should print out like this, right? 1, 2, 3, space Anderson, space 3.5. Correct? Let's double check and make sure it does. It does. Good. Now, I'm going to take those 3 lines and I'm going to comment them all out. Now what should print out for the first student? 0xxx 0.0. Let's see if that happens. Okay? What you end up doing when you write object-oriented programs, for whatever reason, this isn't the greatest explanation. Some books describe them as being components. All right? Maybe when you were a little kid, I don't know, maybe now. It's like, you get one of these kits where you can like put together your own robot type of thing. That's kind of what we're doing here. But what you do when you are creating all this stuff, you are creating the pieces. And what do I mean by that? Well, I just want to show you this, okay? I'm going to undo this. What if we decide, so we're going to go back into our student class, and we're going to decide we don't want just a last name. We now also want a first name. Okay? So we don't want just a last name. We also now want a first name. So we're going to change this from name here. We'll just say here, string name 2. Okay? That's not good, but you get the idea. All right? We're going to have to make some changes. But I mean, again, I'm trying to show you a point here. Now I'm going to get an error because I've got a last name, but I don't have a first name right here yet. All right, don't let that bother you. And so this will be name, and this will be name 2. All right, it's giving me that error because I don't have a first name. So what am I going to do? I'm going to grab everything that I did here, everything, for last name. Come on. All of this. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, and I'm going to paste it back in again. But now I'm going to put in here first name. All right. Why doesn't it like?
You have 2 S's in your original first name at the top.
Is that right? Thank you. Well, look at that.
And you always do that.
Yeah, I was going to say that was pretty cool. Yes, I did. Thank you. All right. Yeah, it's still got an F in it. Let's try to clean this up a little. So, again, I'm going to change this to L name. and we'll change this because it'll make it easier to read, that's all, to F name. Okay? And then this will now become L name. Oops. L name. This will now become F name. All right, that should have fixed that. All right, we'll set this here. We'll set the first name. Just so it's a little different. All right. So we now have first name. We now have last name. Okay. This one should be okay now. I may have made a mistake. I don't think I have, but we'll see. All right. But I'm going to come back to the program now, and here, notice now I get an error. Why? Because it's expecting a first name. We didn't give it one. So let's say that this was James Marco. Notice, now it's okay. All right? So now we can come in here, and we can say first name. I don't know if you guys have ever heard the comedian Louis Anderson. All right? And this one, I don't drink, but I imagine that there are probably some of you in here that do. So that will be Jack Daniels. All right. And now when we display this stuff, well, we have to come in here. Now this may end up looking funky, okay, just because of what I've got here. But let's see if we put this in, and I'll just do this. I'll put in 2. Let's put in a -10 again. Again, this may look really funky when we do this. I don't know. So this will now have to be 3. And we'll just put in here ID number, Stu dot. Notice it already recognizes first name. Stu last name. All right. So hopefully I didn't screw too much stuff up, but we'll see. So let's save this and run it. Well, that comma is kind of weird, but you get the idea? So now, originally, it did not have a property for the first name. An object only has the abilities that you give it. We did not give it the ability to have a first name. Now we did. And you'll notice with this one, it did put in our default value for both the first name, the last name, and the GPA, and the number. All right? Now, I'm not going to say to you, hey, that totally makes sense, because maybe it did, and maybe it didn't. I will tell you that if you've gotten by so far, and even if you got an A in here, but you've never read the book, I would strongly suggest you read chapters 9, 10, and 11. All right? The examples that they give, I give this woman credit. They're pretty darn good. They're not great, but they're pretty darn good. All right? In my opinion. You may agree with that, you may not, and that's fine. All right? Now, I did have problems. She wanted you in the student class to put this in. And for whatever reason, when I put, I'm going to undo this just so you see it, and then I'll put this one here. All right? And it doesn't like that particular colon. I don't know why. Okay? I'm not sure why that is, but it doesn't. So what I just did was the more old-fashioned way. Okay? That's all. Now, that said, if we get it, if I get time and look at it, get it to work, fine, then we'll do that. And if we can't get it to work, then we don't do that. All right? But what we've looked at then in these 3 examples, in the first example, we hard-coded everything. Okay, we hard-coded in the first name. I'm sorry, we hard-coded in the ID number. We hard-coded in the first name. We hard-coded in the GPA. The only thing we did any validation on was the GPA field. It had to be between 0 and 4. If it was less than 0 or greater than 4, we reset it to 0. I also went back in that example and showed you how, if we wanted to, we could use the math.abs property. So even if somebody foolishly put a negative number in, okay? And, you know, when you look at this, if you look up on the screen here, we could have done that here too, right? If somehow somebody did that, but then right now the way we've got it set up, okay, right now we're checking to make sure it's greater than or equal to 0. But if we came up here and said that GPA is equal to math.abs GPA, it'd be impossible to have a negative number. I want to say that again. I want you to understand what I just said. If I came up here and in this routine, I said this, all right, value, okay, I'd have to do it in a set, I'm sorry. If I came through here at the beginning and I said value equals math.abs value, that would say that if for some reason somebody put a negative value before that GPA, if for some reason somebody did that, make it positive. All right, so somebody fat fingers and Jesse's GPA is a 3.8, but they accidentally put in a minus 3.8. Okay? Well, that'll change it back to a 3.8. If I do that, then all I have to check for is that. Does that make sense? All right. Now, would you want to do that? I don't know. It depends on the specs. What I'm trying to show you, though, is what's really important when you start writing these things is every object that you create, all of the stuff that's in the object. So in our case, the person's last name, the person's ID number, and the person's GPA. They have to all be valid values. All right, all those different values that you put in for the student object, that together, all those values, they constitute what's called the student's state. Did you hear what I said? You're going to hear that word again. Not in this class, in other classes. You want to make sure in object-oriented programming that you always keep the object in a consistent state. How do we do that? We make sure, now, here, look on the screen if you would. Tell me if this would work or not. Would that still work? I'll run it a second. Would that still work? Matthew says yes. How many people say yes? How many people say no? It will work. But as you probably guess, that person doesn't have a first name or a last name now. But that's still a valid value because it is what? It is an empty string, but an empty string. When we get into Chapter 11, we'll check for that. And if we put nothing in for the name, we'll do what's called throw an exception. We'll throw an exception where we'll put a value in there that says first name not inputted. We'll actually put a value in there. And I've said this before, you may or may not have heard it, I don't know. But it's like, okay, I've got an 8-month-old grandchild. And my daughter likes to take her for walks around the neighborhood. And she was saying how some lady she'd never met came up and said, "Oh, can I look at her? Oh, she's so cute." All right? But it wouldn't be all that far among the range of possibilities for her to say, "What an exceptional looking child." Okay? When you say exception with programming, it's a bad thing. Because it's an exception to the rule. All right? We're going to take a break in just a minute, but after we get back, I'm giving you this handout. And I'm going to spend a good hour going over every frickin' thing I can think of in this handout. All right? And then once you say, "Yeah, I get it," good. Because it's a hell of a lot of typing, but I'm going to ask you to do every bit of it. You know, when people say, "Well, that isn't fair." Well, hell, I had to do it. All right? And I want to show you what we're going to be doing after the break, and then we'll take a break. All right? Payroll, calculator, miscellaneous. Okay, do it this way. Well, I'll have to find it. But we're going to create objects. But the objects that we create are going to be they're going to be employee objects. Okay? Every employee will have a first name, a middle initial, a last name, an employee number, a designation as to whether or not they're a union member. Okay? They'll all have an hours worked, and they'll all have an hourly rate. We'll use their hours worked and their hourly rate to give them all a gross pay. Make sense? So everybody will have those 8 fields. So it's 9:01. Let's come back at 9:15. I'm going to give you all the handout, and I'm going to go over it. What I want is to go over it like crazy, and I want you to tell me if something does not make sense. All right? Then I'm going to give, then this will be part of your next assignment, will be for you to replicate this. Comments and all. All right? Everything. All right, so let's take a break. 9:15, please.